Hi guys, I'm Rochelle from the full-time class, and today I'm going to be talking about testing in React, specifically testing using React testing library in Jest. If you guys haven't come across testing library, I'll just bring it up. It's testing library.com, and it's really useful for testing React, specifically React components. So why should we bother testing our components? Testing is done to ensure that our app will work as intended for your end users. Having tests will make your app more robust and less error prone. It's a way to verify the code is doing what the developers intended to do. The person who created React Testing Library is a guy called Kent C. Dodds. He sums it up really well, actually. He says, the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. I think that's a really concise way to describe why you should test. So what is Jest and React Testing Library? React Testing Library is a powerful yet simple library, and it works alongside Testing Library Jest to provide testing for specific React components. So you can verify DOM attributes, content, click events, and other types of events in the library. So that's a brief summary of what testing library is. There's also Jest, which I recommend looking at, Jest snapshot testing, because they work kind of in conjunction together. So let's look at writing our first test. So I've got here a simple counter component. I can show you that in the
Can
browser.
you read it, or maybe a bit more of Zoom?
A bit more.
You can zoom a bit. Okay, thank you.
So it's just a simple counter component. If you have a look in the browser, all it does is decrements and increments on click, and you can reset it as well. So it's pretty straightforward. So based on this component, does anyone know what we should actually be testing here? Any ideas? Yeah, so basically just testing exactly the functionality to make sure that when we do click the plus button, it does increment, and when we do click the minus button, it decrements. Because that's essentially what users are going to be doing when they go onto the app. So you want to make sure that functionality works. So that's a good starting point for writing our first test. So if you go back to our VS Code, and the first thing we do when creating a test, we need to, our app is running an app.js. So the first thing we need to do is create, we've got an app.css. We need to create an app test.js. So no matter what the component's called, if you've got a component called training, for example, training.js, your test would be training-test.js. So you also have to have the test file alongside your component. And I've got one here, an empty one, so we can start by creating our first test. So the first thing we need to do when writing a test, it's similar to any React component, is have a list of imports at the top of our file. So the first thing we need to do, obviously, is import React from React. And secondly, we need to import the methods we're going to be using within our test. And there are various methods within React Testing Library we can use. Thanks. Yeah, so we're going to have to import our render methods as well. So the methods we're going to be using today are, we have to render the component. So we're going to be importing the render method, and another method we're going to be using is the fire event method, and this is specific to React Testing Library, and it allows you to test like clickable events. So we'll import these.
Is this the built-in library in React?
It's built in. You can, if you're not using Create React App, you can import it, but testing library is now built in to Create React App along with Jest, so you don't actually need to like install it with npm or anything. So just import it from testing library. And it is from here. And lastly, we need to import the component we're testing. In this case, we're testing the app.js component. So we'll go ahead and import that. So that's all our imports. And the next thing we need to do, once we've got our imports, we can actually start writing our first test. So the first thing we need to do, we need to kind of describe what our test is going to be doing. So there's actually a method for that called describe. And that's included actually in Jest. So we're just going to describe. And here we need to actually describe what our test is going to be doing. In this case, I'll put something like testing the app component. So something like that, just so it's clear what we're actually testing. And so once we've done that, that's just a brief overview of our test. We can also make a little bit more detailed. Describe is not a necessity when writing a test. You don't have to include the describe method. That's just, I've just put it there as like an extra thing. So if there's a team of developers, it's pretty clear what you're doing, because there's another method we're going to use, which is yeah, you don't have to actually necessarily use that, but you have to use test. I'll just show you. So this is, the next thing we have to include is, this is a necessity. I don't know if you've seen it in the Coderi platform, IT. Has anyone seen it? Yeah, so that is a necessity when writing tests, and that's actually the same as writing test. They're the same thing. Oh, I haven't, yeah. Now my thing is gone. So let's make sure this is properly formatted first. So I'm just going to right click, format, just make sure it's nice and clean. Yeah, so IT, you've probably seen that in the Coderi platform. Like I said, that's the same. IT is actually the same as test. So if you see IT or test, they're actually both the same thing. But I'm going to use IT today just because we use it on the platform. And this is, you have to use this when you're writing a test. Describe is not necessary, but this is actually necessary. So here I'll put a little bit more detail so it's clearer exactly what we're testing. So I might put something like properly increments, maybe. Increments. And decrements, the counter, and that's just a more detailed overview of what we're testing. So the one described at the top just says testing the functionality, like what are you actually testing, what functionality. But this one is a little more clear. It just says properly increments and decrements the counter. And so that's our basic test setup. And once we've kind of described and put a clear description about what we're testing, we then need to create a list of variables. So the reason we create variables, so there are different queries within the React testing library, and I'll just show you actually. There's a cheat sheet here, and there's different queries where you can that you can use to get elements from your component. In this case, I'm going to use the one GetBy. I'm going to use GetByText. So we're going to pull out all of the button components and get them by text, and I'll show you how that works. So we'll use const and set GetBy. GetByText. And the first thing we need to do is actually render the app. So we're going to render the app so it does run when we run our test. And the second thing we need to include is our counter, which is just the counter state. So that's going to be GetByText again. And that is GetByText 0 because that's what the counter starts at. And next is our increment button. And again, we're going to use GetByText. And the text on our button is just the plus sign. And we can repeat the same thing for a decrement button. And again, it's the same process. We're just going to add our minus.
So is this bit just basically feeding it information?
Yeah, so basically your the reason you set up variables, is to tell the test what exactly you need testing, so to set up the initial variables for your test. And we'll do the same for the reset button. I'll go into a little bit more detail about why we're doing each section afterwards. There's a way to make testing slightly easier if you follow a certain process. And then I'm going to put here that just to make it. So you asked about why we're setting these variables up. If we break it down, there's a pattern for testing. It's called the AAA pattern. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It's basically arrange, act, and assert. The arrange section is what we're doing now with our variables. It's where you set up the objects to be tested. So here, just making it clear what exactly needs to be tested. And then the next section would be our act section. And act is where we, if there's events to be tested, in this case there's click events. So this is where we would write our act, which is our fire event to be tested. So the first thing we need to do is use the method that we imported, which is fire event. And what kind of event is fire event? It's actually a click event. And then here we pass in what we actually need to test. Does anyone know what we pass into this .click? Does anyone know what would be passed in to .click? So we would pass in our button component that we actually need to test. So we're going to pass an increment button.
Do you put both of them in, or just?
No, we're going to write our fire events separately for each button. So this would be for the increment button. And after we've done that, we're going to make an assertion. So assertion is basically, let's do assert. So assert is what you expect to happen once the test has run. So you can basically make claims about the outcome of what you expect to happen when the fire event has been triggered. So in this case, we're going to put expect, and you always need to write expect. You might have seen it on the platform as well. So you expect, and what do you expect to happen? We don't want to expect that.
The fire event does get the button on by class?
Yeah, so we've assigned GetByText, which is a query from a testing library. There are other ways. I'll just show you. There are other ways you can do find by, query by, and you can also pass a testing ID to your components as well, which I'll show you later. But there are different ways. Some are more strict than others. GetByText is quite loose, so it's not as strict when you're testing. Yeah, you can. GetByText is just a way to query the things. On my H1, I've got a data test ID. That's quite a good way to, and you can see I've also got, yeah, it's just a good way to isolate the names of your tests. But you can also get by text, that's also not a problem. But if you write here, expect, and what do we expect to happen when the button's clicked? We expect the counter, and then text content. Text content is similar to GetByText. And what do we expect it to happen? So if it's on 0, yeah, well, it's going to go up by 1, so it's going to be 1 to equal.
Oh, okay. You type in the result.
The result,
action.
yeah. So dot to equal 1. And we need to pay attention to our, oh yeah, my formatting is wrong.
Would one be a string as well?
It's, in this case, it's not a string. You could, it wouldn't be a string, no.
Okay. Is that because it's not like following GetByText?
It's not following it. This would be the value that's outputted once the function hasn't actually been clicked. So we then look at the outputted value rather than the original string. So this would be our initial setup of our first button, and we can do the same for our decrement button as well. I'll just copy and paste it. Decrement. So if it's been clicked, if it's gone up by 1 and it's on 1, it will go down to back down to 0, and that's what we expect to happen. And let's have a look at this and see if this actually runs.
And if it starts at 0, it will go down to -1.
It depends. So fire event is just fire. So fire event it's only fired once here. And if you fire it twice, you can fire it more than once, but we're just firing it in this instance once. So if it's fired one here, it's gone up by one, and you decrement, yeah. So then you click it again, rather than independently, yeah. So if we copy this, and we can do the same with our reset. So we've got a reset button, and we'll do the same thing for that. You want to know what we're doing? So if we go to our terminal and we run npm run test, it's failed. Because I'm missing my closing rows. Let's see. Let me get my text. My IT is wrong. So because my IT should not work. So now it should work, hopefully. So what's happened? Missing closing. My imports and all again. Because I'm just gonna implement this out, and then so our tests have actually passed. That's because it's working fine. But if we go to our app, I've actually deliberately made a mistake here, because if someone comes along to our app now, and we've done GetByText, and I've started, it runs in the browser as well, just show you it's working fine. So this is working fine. If I reset, it's fine. But if another developer comes along, at the moment my GetByText is not very strict, so I could come along. Someone's come along and deleted my reset button, but I actually needed that there. And you can see our tests, there's been no error with our testing. That's because when I did GetByText, I did GetByText 0, but I didn't call it by the button. So when you're writing your variables, you really have to make sure that the names are correct. So now I've got reset here. It's failed because it's showing me that there's no button, because the button's actually been deleted. So let's go back and bring our button back, and the test should pass, and it's passed again. So when setting up our variables, we have to make sure that the names are actually correct. And the final thing is, when we're testing, we don't only have to test the functionality. We can test things like headings. We can test like UI as well. So here I've written another test, which is just testing our counter header. So we can see at the top, we've got the word counter. It's obviously a counter. What if someone else comes along and changes our counter to, I don't know, let's see if that works. Obviously it's failed. That's because we've used, we've written a second test here. So we've got our describe methods, testing the app component as before. Then we've got our IT, which is actually our test. And it says H1 always has the word counter. And obviously the word counter is no longer there. If we go to our browser, we can see it says Kodiri. So obviously that test is going to fail. But if you look at what to expect, it says expect title. And here I've got GetByText ID, which is our H1 tag, which is what I showed you here before. That's our test ID. But if I change it back to counter, let's call it. Does anyone think this is going to work? It hasn't worked. I don't know why. Yep. So we've got Batman's counter, and again, that's passed, even though it's still wrong, but it does contain the word counter. So again, this is a loose test. So someone can't come and change this now to calculator. It still has to have the word counter in it. So to have text content is another method. It's a bit like to equal. They're just methods we can use for our tests. And I would recommend, like I said, going to testing library, and you can see all the queries here. When you're testing, it's just a case of knowing how strict you want your tests to be and which queries you need to use for each test. So there are different, like I said, there are different custom matches within the React testing library, and to have text content, this allows you to check whether the element has the exact text or not. So the best way, like I said, to set up your tests is to use the AAA pattern, arrange, act, and assert, and that's just a really good way to make sure your tests are doing what they're supposed to. As you can see in our second test, we've only got arrange and assert. The reason there's no act is because we're not checking click events. This is just a UI test. If we had another button that we needed to check, we could add that here, but in this case we're not doing that, so it's just arrange and assert. So we're just arranging again what we need to test, which is our variable, and in this case it would just render the whole app. And then we're just asserting what we need, so what we expect to happen in our second test. So in the expect section, you just call a method and pass in the dependencies and capture the output if there's any output. So in this case, these are the dependencies we're passing in, and this is what we expect to happen when the test has run. So if we change our tests slightly, if someone comes along and says, oh, actually, I want my counter to start at 5. Let's wait for our test to run. Do you think it's going to pass? No, it's going to fail because in our app.js test, we have GetByText zeros because we expect our counter to always start at 0. So to run the test in the terminal, I'll just shut this down. It's actually already, so it's already built in. So testing library is already built in. So is Jest, and to run the test, it's just as you would npm start. It's npm run test. And there are different, if you've got a multitude of tests in different components, so it's just one component with one test, you can press A to run all the tests for the different components. or and you can also just leave this running in the background, and then it will as you're typing or as you're developing, it will continue to test as you go, or you can just shut it down and test as whenever you're ready to test. Yep. So if you look in our package.json, you don't need to download anything. Everything's included. If you use Create React App, everything's included in there. Jest is part of, and so is React Testing Library. Yeah.
What are the dependencies that come together when you create the React app?
So you can see this I'm using is just Create React App. And if you have a look, it's got the testing library website. So if you look on here, it's got an installation guide. Just npm install, you can copy that. If you're starting an app from scratch and you're installing everything from scratch, it's a really easy way to install. I would recommend actually looking at the cheat sheet, because it has all the methods in there that you could use, all the queries, React Testing Library. I would also recommend looking at Jest, the snapshot testing. I'll put the links in the descriptions. And that just is a good overview of testing with Jest. And they both work really well hand in hand together, because the testing library, like I said, it allows you to test elements in the DOM. And I would also recommend looking at the GitHub, and it has all the matches, and it's got like a table of contents of the different matches, and this is the one we have used, as you can see, in our to test our text. Have text content, it tells you what each one does, so it's just a case of you deciding what you want your app to do, the functionality, and which query and which matches would work best for your test. And once you figure that out, if you follow the AAA pattern, writing tests should be quite straightforward. I would also recommend looking at Kenzie Dodds. He is the guy who founded the React Testing Library, and not just for testing, there's some really good information actually on here, just about coding in general and developing. So I would recommend looking at that if you do have a chance. But yeah, that's just a brief overview of React testing. If anyone has any questions, let me know. No?
Actually, what sort of things should we be testing, like as a priority?
As a priority, the first thing you need to understand is what your app is actually doing. Like in this case, it's just a simple counter. So I think the best thing, like I said, the quotes from Kenzie Dodds, you should really be testing what your users will be doing when they go onto your app or your website. So if there's clickable events like buttons, they're important to test. It really just does depend on the app you're using or the app you're creating, but I think you should test your app or your website or whatever you're testing from the perspective of the user. So just make sure that the software you've created or functions you've created run as they're expected to run. So if you've got a sum function, for example, and it's 2 plus 2, you know the expected output should be 4. So you want to write a test for that to make sure that the output for that sum is actually 4. So when so the test will pick it up, and if another developer comes along and changes something, like changes it to 1 plus 2, the test will fail because the output should have been 4. So that's a good starting point, I think, just to make sure any functions, button clicks, DOM elements. I think you can literally test everything, but I think sticking to testing what the user experiences and what the user expects to happen, that's a good starting point. Yeah. Thanks.